All right, welcome everyone. We're happy to have Hannah from Union of Concerned Scientists here with us today. I'm Hazel Anderson. I'm the Science Policy Chair of MSU SciComm. MSU SciComm is a student-run organization focusing on science communication at Michigan State University through science writing, science art, and science policy. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Hannah.
Thanks, Hazel. Hi, everyone. Good to see you here today. Thanks so much for joining. I'm really excited to be speaking to you about demystifying the disinformation machine and the intersection of science and democracy. So today I'm going to provide a brief background into the Union of Concerned Scientists, the organization I work for, and then dig into the history of disinformation in the United States, the current purveyors of disinformation, and what you can do to take action. So I'll be speaking for about 20 minutes, and then we're actually going to break into small breakout rooms, and I'll give you instructions for how you can start researching this and really talking about what's happening in Michigan right now. And then we'll come back together to discuss, and I'll give you the tools that you can take home with you. So feel free to keep your video on or off right now, but then we will send you into breakout groups in about 20 minutes where you'll get to discuss the content with other folks. As a brief background on the Union of Concerned Scientists, we are a science advocacy nonprofit that was founded about 50 years ago by faculty and scientists at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. At the time, scientists were really concerned because they were seeing a lot of funding going into weapons systems, and they wanted to make sure that science is used to solve society's problems rather than to exacerbate them. We've been working on that mission ever since. So on our staff, we have lobbyists, scientists, analysts, policy specialists, and then organizing staff like myself. We work on a variety of issues, from clean transportation to climate and energy to food and the environment. And with all those issues, we create technical analysis, those research reports, and then we work to put that analysis into policy. We also think really strategically about how we can leverage the unique asset of the scientists across the country, our supporter base, who are all of you, thinking about how we can train our scientists to get involved and take action on the issues you care about most in your community. The health of our democracy quite literally depends on scientists as participants and as policymakers. And we've seen this really clearly with the rollout of the COVID-19 vaccination program and the deadly consequences of ignoring or distorting scientific recommendations. My colleagues have written about 3 key ways that scientists and science advocates can rise to the defense of democracy. The first is that scientists contribute to the process by effectively communicating their expertise to communities, decision makers, and the media. The second is that scientists can provide the public with access to reliable scientific information. And the third is you can cultivate networks of activists to take action and speak out about the benefits of science and why it's crucial that we have evidence-based policies. Scientists are trained to separate truth from fiction. And within that, you are, apologies for the helicopter in the background, you're the most important communicators of the importance of science in public decisions. Science is political, but it's not partisan. There are both Democrats and Republicans who support election integrity and those who do not. When corporate interests have disproportionate political influence, they misrepresent and misuse science to distort public deliberation. This then allows powerful interests to insulate themselves from public accountability through legal and regulatory structures. Weak democratic institutions offer less protection from that political interference and from attacks on science. Under the influence of authoritarian power, science can be used as a weapon that impacts ideological, political, and socioeconomic goals. And so the key point here is that science can speak truth to power, but it doesn't correlate with partisanship. There are many good Republicans who are supporting election integrity and fighting this attack on our democratic heritage just alongside Democrats. Now I want to get a little bit into some definitions and clarify the key distinction between misinformation and disinformation. Misinformation is the spread of false information which can be purposeful or accidental. Disinformation, on the other hand, is deliberate. Disinformation is always deliberate. Really want to emphasize that. And so to start understanding how we can prevent disinformation, we have to understand who is purposefully funding it and purposefully fueling this effort. There's far too little attention currently in the media and in the public understanding of who these bad actors are. And much of the disinformation that we see today, especially around issues such as climate, democracy, and workers' rights and safety, all come from the same folks. These folks are highly organized, connected, and integrated. They have been making a network that has been building since 1971. In 1971, 50 years ago from this August, there was a tobacco lobbyist and a future Supreme Court justice named Lewis Powell. Lewis Powell wrote a memorandum to the Chamber of Commerce that was then named the Pal Memo. It is seen as a blueprint for corporate survival in the face of the civil rights, labor, and environmental gains that were made in the 1960s. And it includes clear instructions for the corporate subversion of the government, of courts, of media, and academia. Most of the tactics that we've seen on display in those 4 areas are exactly what these players have been implementing for the last 5 decades. This is one of the most influential documents in US history, and yet hardly anyone knows about it. This is very indicative of the lack of attention and understanding in the press and in the public about just how coordinated and deliberate this effort is. In the years following Powell's memo, much of the critical infrastructure to advance the free market and anti-government agenda took shape. And this included, but was not limited to, the American Legislative Exchange Commission, or ALEC, the State Policy Network, Americans for Prosperity, and the Council for National Policy. There's a handful of funders behind most of these national efforts. Some of the names might be familiar to some of you: Koch, Mercer, Bradley, DeVos, Coors. And then there are also some state level players that also have significant influence. For example, Art Pope in North Carolina, or Rex Sinquefield in Missouri. While most of these folks have shared interests and agendas, such as those on the slide, privatizing prisons, gutting environmental rules, limiting voter rights and access, there are also some funders who choose specific strategies that are of high interest. For example, the DeVos family focuses on privatizing education, and the Mercers are mega funders of Powell's media strategy. But because we have a short time together today, I'm going to focus on one of the funders that's actually one of the most expansive and influential, and this is the Koch Network. Charles Koch is a billionaire businessman from Kansas who owns Koch Industries, which is one of the largest privately owned businesses in the United States. It owns a diverse group of companies that are involved in a whole variety of processes, from refining chemicals to pollution control equipment, minerals, fertilizers, commodity trading, forest and consumer products, and ranching. The New Yorker has described David Koch and his brother Charles Koch as longtime libertarians who believe in drastically lower personal and corporate taxes, minimal social services for the needy, and much less oversight of industry, especially environmental regulation. Charles Koch then surrounded himself with other folks of similar minds, such as Richard Fink, who is a former tobacco lobbyist and helped develop a system for influencing cultural and policy change that would advance their ideological and political agenda, which they called the structure of social change. And so to help Fink implement this strategy, Koch created a whole network, a constellation of groups funded by himself and about 700 other like-minded conservatives and libertarians that would all contribute at least $100,000 annually to advance this free market, anti-government, and anti-regulatory agenda. This Koch network was formerly known as the Seminar Network, but recently rebranded as Stand Together. And now we're going to dig a little bit further into this structure of social change. And what's important to know here is that all of this is focused on converting private money into public policy change. But there are 3 main steps. So step 1 is that This network funds scholarly activity at universities in order to create intellectual raw materials. So in other words, you find free market loving scholars that you can pay to churn out research that then advances the Koch Network's ideological and political agenda. My colleague worked at Unkoch My Campus a few years back and focused specifically on the academic research that was attacking environmental efforts, and noticed that there were documents, for example, in 2013, that showed that a Koch-funded institute at Suffolk University promised its corporate donors research that would pave the way for legislative activity that then would pare back or repeal the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. Academic research that is funded by Koch is then passed along to Koch-funded think tanks and has this seeming stamp of approval, this sheen of legitimacy, because it comes from an academic institution where the Koch-funded academic conducted that research. So keep in mind that we know that Charles Koch funds academic programs that specifically contribute in some way, this is a quote, Koch said, that contribute in some way to our individual companies or to the general welfare of our free enterprise system. So he stated that in 1974 in a memo to corporate leaders who were building off of Pal's recommendations for how to get their money into policy change. Okay, step 2. They're funding think tanks that will convert that abstract academic work into more digestible forms. For example, reports or policy briefs or lobbying materials. Most of these think tanks are members of the State Policy Network, SPN, which is collectively, quote, devoted to discovering and developing market-oriented solutions to state and local public policy issues. The State Policy Network and Heritage Foundation are the primary authors of model voter suppression bills that we're seeing spill across states today. And their respective sister organizations, the American Legislative Exchange Council and Heritage Action, then advocate to get those bills enacted. So one way to think about SPN is that it's the policy, communications, and litigation arm of ALEC. And that gives this cookie cutter ALEC agenda a sheen, again, of academic legitimacy and this idea that has state-based support. So many of these SPN groups often write ALEC model bills. Then step 3 happens, which is that they fund citizen implementation groups and politicians in order to make sure that those policy reports from the think tanks are actually codified into law. So some examples of these groups are Americans for Prosperity, Libre, which focuses on a Latinx audience, and Generation Opportunity, which focused on younger generations. Researchers at Harvard and Columbia universities have found that Americans for Prosperity alone in 2018 rivaled the Republican Party in terms of size, staffing, and organizational capacity. It has pulled, quote, the Republican Party to the far right on economic, tax, and regulatory issues. And Americans for Prosperity was crucial to the success of the Tea Party movement, the ousting of Democrats from Congress, and the staffing of Trump's transition team. Okay, so now we're going to unpack ALEC and Heritage Action a little further. And this is an example of that third bucket. ALEC is the American Legislative Exchange Commission, and it's a corporate bill mill. Through ALEC, corporations hand state legislators their wish lists to benefit their bottom line. Corporations fund almost all of ALEC's operations. They pay for a seat on ALEC task forces, where corporate lobbyists and special interest representatives vote with ALEC member elected officials to approve those model bills. These elected officials are essentially spoon-fed policies that support the corporation's bottom line. The corporations are leading these conversations around strategy, not the legislators. And it's important to note here that the average person does not have this kind of access to elected officials, nor do you or I have this kind of influence over them like corporations do. And these corporations have been slipping them money for years. That's a lot. To digest this a little further, I'm going to introduce you to Jessica Anderson, who's the Executive Director of Heritage Action, one of those model legislation groups that we mentioned in that third step.
Iowa was the first state that we got to work in, and we did it quickly and we did it quietly. Honestly, nobody noticed. At the end of the day, the bill that Governor Kemp signed and the Georgia legislature marshaled through had 8 key provisions that Heritage recommended.
This leaked video reveals how Heritage is leading a massive right-wing campaign to suppress voting rights in key battleground states like Georgia, Arizona, Florida, and Iowa just this year.
We're working with these state legislators to make sure they have all of the information they need to draft the bills. In some cases, we actually draft them for them, or we have a sentinel on our behalf give them the model legislation. So it has that grassroots, from the bottom up type of vibe.
While these bills are being sold as protecting quote unquote election integrity, the real purpose seems to be to help Republicans win elections. They plan to spend $24 million over the next 2 years in Michigan, Nevada, Wisconsin, Texas,
Pennsylvania,
and beyond to quote unquote right the wrongs of November.
And we are going to take the fierce fire that is in every single one of our bellies to right the wrongs of November, to right the wrongs of the mistreatment against these men, and move it into other states.
The Heritage Foundation is one of the best funded think tanks in Republican circles. They write the policy, and their sister organization, the dark money group Heritage Action, makes it happen. From writing and advocating these anti-democratic bills to leading the effort to block the For the People Act in Congress, Heritage is weaponizing Trump's big lie to motivate their donors and their base to strip Americans of their fundamental right to vote.
So I think that's a really important example just of how coordinated and strategic and purposeful all of this is. And we talk about voting rights in relation to this intersection of science and democracy because this network's infrastructure is really versatile. It can and it has been used to advance this free market, anti-government, anti-regulatory agenda, and that shows up in the form of attacks on climate progress, fair wages, public education, and more. And voting specifically is power. It's a right that enables us to select candidates who we think best align with our values and who advance the issues that we care about, whether that's climate change or fair wages or something else. And without this right to vote, we lose some of our power, which is precisely the reason why groups like Heritage and ALEC and those funding and fueling them are investing so heavily in gerrymandering and passing voter restriction laws, as seen specifically in this next quote. The founder of Heritage Foundation and early leader of ALEC, Paul Memo, said, "I don't want everybody to vote. Elections are not won by a majority of the people. They never have been from the beginning of our country, and they are not now. As a matter of fact, our leverage in the elections quite candidly goes up as the voting populace goes down." So many Republicans may claim that their motivation in voting restrictions is grounded in concerns over voter fraud, but this quote better represents the truth, which is that as the voting restrictions that Republicans are pushing will disproportionately make it harder for Black and Brown and young voters to participate in electoral process. And I want to close this section of presentation by reminding you that there's actually a lot of power in having this information. The more that all of us understand what's happening and feel enraged, shocked, upset about what's going on, then we're better able to channel this into taking action for the public good. So I remember when I first learned this, I said, oh my goodness, what can I do? There's so much going on here. I was very upset, but there's actually some very specific opportunities that we can win. You might think that we're up against this highly coordinated network of billionaires and their affiliates, but there are two silver linings. One is that this network and their efforts are highly predictable. My colleague spent the last decade learning about the radical right, and actually she said that very little they do surprises her at this point. It's not because she's optimistic, she's not like a glass half empty, half full kind of person. It's just that she knows that they've been implementing the same playbook that was charted out in the Pal Memo this whole time. And so by understanding how the Pal Memo works, you can pay attention to the flaws and vulnerabilities and exploit those and plan ahead. Also, there is a specific reason why these networks have spent over 3 decades trying to take away collective bargaining rights. That's because when we as the general public are organized, working in coalitions and partnerships with different local groups, taking collective action, we can win. So today we're going to take one step in trying to unpack this and understand it further by getting into a little research in small groups. We're going to pay attention to the anti, in some cases pro-democracy legislation that's happening in Michigan right now using existing research. We're also going to look into who the bad actors are, specifically in Michigan, and there's an editable research tracking template that will show you this. And lastly, we're going to look at the other allies in your state and paying attention to who you can reach out to join in this fight. I also want to note that in a minute, I'll show you this template and explain how to break into those groups. But as we do this research, I really encourage each of you to bring your curiosity. The template is pretty easy to follow, and it's going to have links for you to copy and paste. And it might just take you a few minutes to find some of the main information in Michigan. But as scientists or science advocates, we really need you to bring your rigor, your questions, your perspective to investigating what piques your interest. You know, as you're writing down this background information, think about what questions come to mind. Why is this happening? Where else have you seen these people's names? What else would you need to know in order to understand what's going on? And who else might need to know about this? So I'll show you now. This is the example of the template that we're going to go through. And if you're in group 1, you'll be looking at democracy-related bills in your state. And there are going to be these links to the Brennan Center for Justice State Voting Bill Tracker, the Voting Rights Lab State Bill Tracker. And you're just going to take notes in this editable document to show what's happening in Michigan right now. What are the anti-democracy bills that are in motion? What's already passed? And this is an example of what those websites will look like. Again, you'll just search in the table for Michigan. The second group is going to look specifically into key players in Michigan, thinking about who is specifically behind the attacks on democracy in your state. You'll click on those links for the American Legislative Exchange Council and for the State Policy Network, looking up which of your elected officials might be part of those networks. Again, you'll look specifically for Michigan here, and it gives you all those steps. And then if we have enough people for a third group, you'll look into some of the partner organizations that are working on this, the allied organizations in your state, such as Common Cause and Stand Up to ALEC, looking into what kind of activities they're working on and what does the current campaign look like to fight against this. Okay, so I'm gonna stop sharing my screen, pause. I'm happy to take a few questions, and then we're gonna send y'all into breakout groups for 20 minutes to do some of that research. Okay, great. So now I wanted to ask if anyone is willing to share either something they learned in their research or something that you already knew about disinformation in Michigan and what's been happening. Any brave soul willing to share something that they learned or they already knew?
This is Elizabeth Delary. I would just say that I get information about various bills with environmental issues or voter rights just from organizations that send me emails and will be like, sign this petition or read about this issue or send us money. But I haven't really done anything comprehensive. And so if for people who were in group 2, if they didn't look at this, I thought this Voting Rights Lab website was really interesting. I've never looked at it, and to see that there's 76 bills involving voters' rights being currently talked about, and it says which stage that they're in, if they're just being introduced or they pass the second chamber, and then it tells you what the issue is, and is it pro-voting? Some of them are pro-voting, some of them are anti-voting, some of them say that they're mixed or neutral. It's just for like the 10 minutes or so I've been looking at it, I found it really interesting and informative, and I would encourage people to look at that to really just get a good overview of what's going on currently in Michigan.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Yeah, and we'll send Hazel send out all of these links afterwards so you can reference them again. Anyone else have more context about what's been happening in Michigan or something they learned?
was aware, well, I mean, like the gerrymandering lines, I'm in like southeast Michigan, but I actually did not know that they were redrawing the voting lines, which is awesome to hear, especially for Detroit. So I'm actually gonna keep an eye out for those maps later, just to form my own opinion.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
Thanks
I
for
think
that, yeah.
you should look at those because they're really interesting. But it's a lot of sort of a lot of work to look at all of it. But and they're having the meetings around the state for people to make their own kind of constructive statements about them. So I think I don't know what the links are right now, but I think if you go online and look for Michigan redistricting, you'll probably find it there.
Yeah, thank
Yeah,
you.
you can go to voters.politician.org. That would also get you there.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, I think one of the more important things I learned was the threat to all of these rather positive steps in the state of Michigan that the initiative currently being promoted by anti-voters and anti-redistricting, which only requires, what, 380,000 signatures?
I think it's something like 300,000. Yeah.
Yeah, and if 300,000 people sign this, what looks like a request for legislation, it actually goes directly to the legislature, and they can overturn most of these new gerrymandering laws, and this is exempt from any kind of legislative or executive veto by the governor. So I think it's important for people to pay attention, and if you see somebody collecting signatures, let them know what this is all about, and let the people who they are approaching know how dangerous this is.
Thanks, everyone. I see we have about 5 more minutes till 1 p.m. Eastern, so I'll just wrap up to say this is a critical issue. As you just noted, in Michigan, there's a lot of work to be done and sometimes sensitive action opportunities. So I recommend staying in touch all together, thinking about the ways that you all can spread the word about what's happening in Michigan and the threats to democracy that are ongoing as well as time sensitive is a critical way to fight this disinformation and really encourage others to get involved. So as part of the follow-up resources, I'll share those different organizations that are working specifically on this. There's Stand Up to ALEC, Common Cause, and State Voices. So they might be thinking about how to address things like what David just shared. And you also can continue to do that research. We'll share that template so that you can continue to paint that picture of what's the history of disinformation in Michigan, what's currently happening in the legislature, and with those main actors that are funding things. And as always, I'm happy to answer questions. You can reach out to UCS for further ideas or conversation. But thanks so much for joining today, and we hope that you stay in touch with one another and continue to work on misinformation.